So I have an audience here that knows what climate change is all about and what has happened with the old famous hockey stick and the temperature rising so dramatically. And we all people here will know about how in 2015 they got together in Paris and they came to an agreement that had three components: a target of 2050 to be at net zero, a carbon budget, the total amount of carbon that can be put into the air, and a limit of 2 degrees in 2015. And to hit that target, we had to start dramatically dropping the carbon going into the air to stay below the budget. And in 2018, they met again and said, 2 degrees is too hot. We really have to deal and go down to 1.5 degrees. And to go 1.5 degrees, it's no longer a ramp down, it's like a cliff. When this graph was done, they were talking, and this was 2019, they were talking about 420 gigatons left. We're down now to a little over 300. And at the rate we're going, we'll bust the bank, we'll bust the budget in about 7 years. Now, one of the problems when I'm talking to people about this whole situation, is the issue that energy does not equal carbon. I did this in the biggest font that could come out of my computer because it's so important. And for 50 years, we have been preoccupied with energy. And we started being preoccupied with energy, not out of any concern for the environment or anything. It was political, and it's always been political. It started with the Yom Kippur War, with the Israelis actually winning the war and the Arabs then getting together and starting an Arab oil embargo, and the Americans reacting, saying our failure to end dependence on foreign oil, and OPEC oil gets into everything and destroys everything. And so they're not giving us the oil. So we have these shortages and limitations and everybody's lining up. And Jimmy Carter comes along after actually it was Richard Nixon who brought in the lower speed limits, but Jimmy Carter came in, put on his cardigan and told us all we have to start conserving. And everybody hated the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and everybody hated Jimmy Carter for all of this. And then Ronald Reagan came in and he made a deal with the Arab OPEC people to get the taps running again and the oil running again, and said, we're going to drill and we're going to find oil. And we discovered fracking, so that suddenly there was all the gas we needed, and we got the oil sands, and suddenly there wasn't an energy problem anymore. And yet we're still always preoccupied in our building codes and everything else with energy. And when you asked people, like this survey by the Shelton Group, well, what do they care about? They care about saving money more than anything. And energy was cheap, so we couldn't do anything. And this is one of the biggest problems of the Passive House movement. Protecting the environment, only 22% people cared about that. And our grandkids, the hell with them, look at that, 15% to preserve the quality of life for future generations. So this is where we were 2 months ago. Then bang. Everything has changed. It's like you can spend years saying, we've got to do something, we've got to do something. And it's like Hemingway said about how do you go bankrupt? 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. And we're in the suddenly mode. We've suddenly got pipelines that are no longer pumping. We've got gas prices going to record high. And we've got the American fossil fuel industry saying, we've got to drill, and loosen regulations and drill everywhere. We're suddenly talking in the States about energy security. In Canada, we're talking about building pipelines. And suddenly you see headlines that people are thinking again about conservation, like paging Jimmy Carter, my goodness. And the next one, not since Jimmy Carter was president, our government's under so much pressure to cut energy consumption. This is something we really haven't seen in 40 years. And even I was sort of getting drawn away from all of this, talking over the last year, maybe this obsession with Passive House is not the right way to deal with things, that instead of insulation, we need heat pumpification, that we don't need to insulate and cut the amount of energy we use, we just have to replace it. And even today, I was looking at Andrew Simmons doing a presentation in the UK, which is saying, you know, if the grid is decarbonizing, let's just throw heat pumps at it. But we know now that's not true, that people are saying we got to drill, we got to frack, we got to get more gas, we got to go all of this. And basically, it looks like energy is back on the menu. You know, we have to deal with this, or Jason Kenney's going to boil more rocks and the frackers are going to drill more holes, and any hope of staying under the carbon ceiling is going to be lost. So now let's get back to the 1.5 degree lifestyle that my book was all about. This was a study that came out about 4 years ago out of Aalto University in Finland that basically looked at where it said our emissions are caused by consumption. And it was based on earlier research about what were called lifestyle emissions. And the lifestyle, you know, basically the thesis is, I'm going a slide ahead, that, you know, the vast majority of our emissions come from our personal choices. There are some that come from government and buying F-35 fighters and fighting wars, but the bulk of it is still us making decisions about what we do. And so you can see the declining curve that they're saying the average for the whole world per capita has to get down to 2.5 tons per person by 2030 and down to 1 ton per person by 2050. And the fact of the matter is that half of the world lives under 2.5 tons now. They're the people living in energy poverty in Africa and in South America and in parts of Asia, because they don't have resources and they should be able to get more. And we're way up there on the upper right-hand side. And the other fact is, it's all us, it's all the rich people. We're all in the top percent. Most of us are in the top 1%. And the top 49% are responsible for half the emissions, and the top 1% are responsible for 15%. And, you know, when I talk about carbon footprint, they say, oh, carbon footprint was invented by British Petroleum. It's a distraction. British Petroleum invented the carbon footprint to blame us. Well, they didn't. This guy invented it, Dr. William Rees from Vancouver, was in Vancouver and now in Toronto. They just co-opted it. And you saw all kinds of articles. The personal will not save you. It's performative environmentalism. I love this student at Trent University in the school newspaper wrote this. If we want to save our planet, we need to stop blaming everyday people for the declining environment and hold the real culprit responsible, the fossil fuel industry. Michael Mann says it in his book. He says, not only shouldn't you blame people, but a recent study suggests that the emphasis on small personal actions can actually undermine support for substantive climate policies. That's convenient for Exxon, Shell, and BP. The other thing you hear all the time is this Guardian headline from 4 years ago: just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions. I actually collect tweets that use this as an excuse. 100 companies are responsible. I can assure you my air conditioning doesn't make any difference. Or my favorite, 71% of emissions by 100 companies. Normal people buying Bitcoin to fight the system aren't the problem. 100 companies are responsible for emissions. We're not personally responsible, and cows do so little. You can eat your hamburger. But when you actually look at the report that article was based on, it's not Exxon and that, it's China, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Gazprom, it's Iran, Exxon's number 6, Mexico, Russia, then Royal Dutch Shell, China. These are nations. And the other thing you notice in these columns is that they're talking about different scopes of emissions. And this is really important, because scope 1 is the emissions from making something. Scope 3 is using them, the downstream emissions, and 90% of the emissions of fossil fuels are scope 3. And scope 3 is us. It's buying the stuff, and it's filling our tanks, and it's us burning them. It's us buying the gas that do it. These are the consumption issues that are the problem. Well, I'll just say for 1 minute, a reminder, I took all these slides out, but mentioned it, that when we had the pandemic in the first year of the pandemic, nobody was flying and nobody was driving and we weren't consuming. And what happened? Emissions went down 7%. Oil companies went bankrupt. Airlines went bankrupt. Governments had to step in to save them all because it was consumption driven. Now, in that original study, they broke the components, the domains across domains: nutrition, what we eat; housing, how we live; mobility, how we get around; goods, what we buy; and leisure. So what I did is I made a giant spreadsheet and I broke it all into these categories. I used 2.5 tons as a target, which came out to 6.8 kilograms a day. And I tracked everything I did. But how do you calculate it? It's really hard. Take an example. If I buy an air conditioner, I know I can easily find out the operating carbon from that air conditioner. But that air conditioner is made in China these days. And all of that carbon is then, when I buy the air conditioner, if you talk a consumption point of view, those emissions aren't Chinese, they're mine. Those emissions should be on my ledger and not theirs. And that's because they are what we know now in the building industry as embodied carbon. It's the critical point that everybody here will understand now when they know the importance of embodied carbon in buildings, but it's the issue in everything we touch and do. Now, I've always thought embodied carbon is a terrible name because it's not in the embodied in the product, it's in the atmosphere, it's burped out, and it's counted against the carbon budget now. It's not a life cycle emission, it's a now emission. And fortunately, my term upfront carbon is actually getting some traction and it's being used. And we talk about it all the time. That's why many in the industry are using mass timber, for instance, to reduce those upfront emissions. It's not regulated, but we're talking about it. But in everyday life, embodied carbon is a much bigger deal. Take my iPhone. Apple is great about promoting and giving all of the information for their products. 83% of the carbon involved in my iPhone comes from the production, 3% transporting it to me, and only 13 out is use. And that's exactly what Apple wants. They want the thing to last forever on the battery. And so it's all embodied carbon. And this is the issue with our buildings too. The more efficient they get, the more dominant the embodied carbon becomes. And no one understands that. Like, here was Hyundai running an ad. Why shouldn't a car have the same emissions as a bike? And some smart graffiti kid wrote on it because the carbon embodied in the materials. Hyundai didn't get it, but the graffiti artist did. People have to figure this out and learn about it. So when everybody says they love this big, beautiful Lightning Ford, they don't know because there's no label, there's no way of knowing how much carbon there should be. And the Living Building Challenge people proposed this thing that would have an embodied carbon rating, but nobody's doing it yet. So now we'll go into the sectors. We're going to move away from buildings and that and start where they did with nutrition, the intake of all the food that we eat. And this is a section where I try and explain how difficult it is to do this. There's a Canadian food chain that I really like, the Swiss Chalet rotisserie chicken. And so I had to try and figure out, well, okay, I want to know what is the carbon footprint of me ordering Swiss Chalet chicken. So first I had to figure out, well, the chicken itself has this much, and it was really hard to do because there's no data about it. There's this guy in Britain who wrote How Bad Are the Bananas, this book here, and he rated everything. And so I had to use English chickens, which I know are different than Canadian chickens because our chickens are traveling farther, and British chickens, they have stricter humane standards, so their chickens are further apart. So it's an approximate. Then I went into all the catalogs to figure out, how much energy does that rotisserie take to roast the chicken? Then there's all the plastic, which was the main reason I stopped ordering Swiss Chalet in the first place, because of all the plastic, and I weighed the plastic, and it only came up with 366 grams. And then what killed the whole thing? What's the dominant thing of the whole thing? The delivery. Because Swiss Chalet cooks their chicken here and they deliver it 8 kilometers, and I have to go out and I look at the car and it's a Toyota Corolla, and I asked him if I was the only load in its delivery, and I was, and it just blew everything else away. So I learned, can't order in unless they come by bike or I go walk up and pick it up. And food is really, really hard because it blows away all your previous conceptions. I mean, everybody knows that beef is the worst. And beef is a ruminant. The animal is on its feet for a long time. They live a long time. They eat a lot of grain. They're burping out methane. So beef is the worst. Prawns, shrimp are bad because they're farmed and they're shipped all the way around. And then, you think, okay, I'll be a vegetarian or a vegan. And you see, what? Tomatoes are worse than fish. They're just behind lamb and mutton. Well, it turns out we only get tomatoes out of the field in August and maybe a bit of September. And the rest of the time, they're all grown in hothouses heated with natural gas. So, and then cheese, you can't be a vegetarian because and eat cheese because it's really high. It's actually worse than chicken. And milk, all of these things that come from cows. Milk is worse than pig. So what you have to do is be a climatarian. You have to look at what is low in the diet that works for climate, which for us was no red meat. The other thing is the amount of waste that we have. 40% of food waste is going straight into the garbage. About a third of it in the field, about a third of it in the grocery store, and about a third of it in the back of our fridges. And the other thing about food is that we eat so much more of it, the portion distortion, as it was called, where because of what happened in the restaurant industry, food portions just got bigger and bigger and bigger because for reasons I'll get into later. But we started eating more, and even at home, everywhere, we basically serve far, far bigger portions than they used to, because food has become a far lower proportion of our overall budget. Food has been cheap compared to other things. So because it was cheap, we ate more of it. And often discounted, even by the experts, even by the people who did that table, is the distribution process, the cold chain, getting those strawberries from California to here. That all the studies I looked at, they just counted the diesel fuel involved. But I, in fact, looked into it. What is the energy needed for the refrigeration and the loss of refrigerant gases from the refrigerators, the refrigeration units, and it's huge. And one of my students did a big study and found out that it came up to 20% of the fuel and 3 to 7% of global hydrofluorocarbon gas leakage. So what we did for the year, a few years ago, my wife Kelly was then writing about food, and we lived a seasonal Ontario 19th century diet of meat and root vegetables, parsnips, potatoes, and turnips, and more meat and more turnips, because that's what they had then. They didn't, the Scots and the English people who colonized Canada, they didn't go for the fancy tofu and the Middle Eastern foods and the other ones that we now eat. And my wife does all of her canning, which she does every year, of tomatoes, so I don't get them out of the hothouse. And so what we found with food that you have to do is, yes, if you can go vegan, that's best. But if you can't go vegan, get rid of the red meat and the lamb and the shrimp and eat less of everything. Watch your portions, learn to love leftovers. And if you do take out a delivery, walk or bike to pick it up. Now, how we live, this is very interesting, because as you see, they've got housing footprint and mobility footprint as two separate things. But we're going to talk about this. Now, housing is a big hotspot, and I was extremely lucky here, being a sort of baby boomer of a certain age, that I could buy a house in what 120 years ago was a fancy area of town, which was all big estates at the top of this escarpment overlooking Toronto. Toronto people watching will know Ardwold and Spadina and all of these estates that were up there. And this area was separated by a giant ravine that was very hard to get across. Here you see them doing bicycle races up the hill. And in 1910, they started filling this up with toxic waste coming out of all of the furnaces in Toronto when everybody was coal-fired. And this whole thing is incredibly toxic. And it now looks like this. When I was a real estate developer, I was working on a property next to this. And honestly, we could drill down to see what's in there. And you had 50 feet of absolute shit, the most toxic waste you can imagine, because that's what they used to fill the ditch. And they put streetcar lines in, and I basically live in a streetcar suburb. designed so that everyone could come home from work, pick up a few things they needed in the local shop, and walk a short distance home to nice middle-class houses which didn't have any parking. And that's why the houses are narrow. And that's why it went from in 1890 to mostly farms to 25 years later, completely built out like this. And that's so that everybody's in the small houses who can walk to St. Clair. And I'm the middle house of what is obviously a developer special of the time, because the three of them are all identical. And being a lucky baby boomer, I didn't pay much of it. And after the kids moved out, I downsized to where we live on the ground floor and we rent the upstairs because these houses were adaptable. So in 1920, St. Clair looked like this. And today it looks like this. Not actually much different, although in the year since I took this picture, there's about 5 more condos in the picture. It's rapidly densifying. And it is really a 15-minute city. I can walk 2 blocks if I want to go work in a co-working space. The hospital opened a family clinic, literally a 5-minute walk where my whole family goes. So I've got doctors, I've got food, I've got shopping, I've got everything. And I get everything almost within walking distance because it works, because the development pattern is based on the streetcar. As transport expert Jarrett Walker said in what I thought was the tweet of the decade, land use and transportation are the same thing. They're just described in different languages. How you get around determines what you build, and they're 2 sides of the same coin. Now in the States, just like my house could not have existed without the streetcar, these houses exist because of the car. And just like our energy crisis of the 70s, this is all about politics and war. Because what happened after the Americans and the Russians set off their bombs after the Second World War, they started looking and thinking about that every business and every factory was basically in New York or Chicago or Detroit, and they could all get nuked with 1 bomb. And so they started coming up with policies for dispersal. Defense through decentralization is the only realistic defense. So to read this, they directed all new construction away from congested central areas to outer fringes and the prevention of metropolitan core further spread by directing all new construction into small, widely spaced satellite towns. So basically everybody says, what happened to American cities? Why did they fall apart like that? They fell apart because it was conscious choice to make them fall apart, get all the white people out and set up new businesses out in the country. Eisenhower, who saw the wonderful autobahns in World War II, said, okay, this is how we'll do it. And basically he built the national system of interstate and defense highways, which is the biggest project the government has ever done. And after Miss Concrete and Miss Blacktop had finished this job of cutting all those ribbons, you had a whole nation now where everybody was driving to their suburban houses, decentralized. And more importantly, all the companies. So this was the first, I think it was Hartford Insurance, get all those big companies and all their records out of the cities. So it takes 1 bomb per company. Bell Labs built these, best reception desk there ever was in Bell Labs. Saarinen built these headquarters for IBM. And the whole thing was, everybody, guys, you've got to go out and take your family and you've got to move out here, decentralize, get a job in one of these new factories and offices and live this way. And it was just ingrained into the culture. And it's still, like Elon Musk says, the future we want. The only difference now is that he wants it to be electric. He thinks everybody's going to have the big house with the solar shingle roofs, the power wall in the garage, along with the 2 Teslas. This is the fantasy. But as we all know, it may be 0 carbon operating emissions, but the—
Sorry, could you say that again? My apologies.
Oh, go away. My watch thought I was on Siri here, sorry. So anyhow, it doesn't scale. It is 0 operating emissions, but vast upfront carbon emissions. And that's why we should be looking to increase density, perhaps on the Vienna model. I saw this at a Passive House conference. I saw these Passive House apartment buildings in Munich, We know what to do. We know how to build simple forms that minimize the amount of materials that go into our buildings. We know how to build them with low carbon materials like wood, changing materials. We've known in Canada since 1974 how to build super insulated houses that were like the inspiration for Passive House. We know how to build Passive House. That's L. Ron Burrell photobombing a photo there. We know how to build them big. We know how to use heat pumps to do this properly. So we've got all of not only the technology, but the design skills to do this. We know what to do. So for housing, the answer is in all new buildings, use natural materials, low embodied carbon with super insulation to Passive House standards. It's the only way we should be building. And frankly, after all of the events that we've had in Ukraine and everything else, this should be in every law right now. In existing buildings, reduce demand by as much as possible and meet the reduced demand with heat pumps. And apartments are better than duplexes, 15-minute cities are better than suburbs. And electrify everything. How we move, it's a similar story. It's totally related. Cars indeed have got more efficient. And what happened when they got more efficient? They got bigger and they got ridiculous. And people haven't changed at all. You can look at this picture of the good life from 1960, the car, the boat, the big house, and you look at the Ford ad for today, and it's exactly the same. The only difference is the truck is bigger, the boat is bigger, and the house is bigger. So, we've got to change our perception of what we want and get away from this electric dream, because the problem with electric cars is they're still blocking the sidewalk. They're still blocking the roads exactly the same. When you go into the math, they actually still have significant emissions from their manufacture, from the embodied carbon. Even if you look at Norway, which has an all-electric distribution grid, they're still at about a third. They're still at about 75 grams of carbon emissions per kilometer. If you look at the United States up there, it's like over half as bad. They're still bad. And when you keep making them bigger like this, when you're still making them all these silly pickup trucks, then you've got a lot of embodied carbon. I did a calculation that found that if you bought a small European gasoline car and compared it to a new Ford 150, that the actual carbon footprint per kilometer was lower in the gasoline car. And the boss of the company, I now work, Treehugger's now owned by the biggest English language media company in the world. And he read this and said, what is this? You guys are supposed to be promoting electric cars. And I'm saying, no, we're not going to promote these. You've got to understand what embodied carbon is. I was just explaining this last week to this woman and she did not get it. There's me on my e-bike talking to her in her Tesla, but we're car obsessed in North America. Everybody's talking cars all the time. When oil prices went up, when gas prices went up, people like Gavin Newsom start throwing money. Rich couple with 3 Escalades gets $1,200. A person with an EV gets $400. Person with an e-bike gets nothing. And these tax cuts helped the Kremlin and punish Ukraine. In World War II, there was this, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, join a car sharing club. One guy I know went and changed them all. When you drive a car, you drive with Putin, ride your bike, go take mass transit. When British Columbia announced they're giving $110 to everyone, well, governments should be subsidizing e-bikes, not gasoline prices. That's my e-bike. I ride it everywhere. I didn't drive a car for the whole year. It was hard in winter. You had to get dressed up pretty warmly, and I looked like this on some of the bad days. But for us to do it, we've got to have good cities. We've got to have places to ride and places to park the bike. When I looked in Vienna, when I was in Vienna, I just loved this street, that you had a place for walking, a place for the bike, a place for sitting waiting for the streetcar, a streetcar, and then you had a lane for roads. Toronto temporarily did this because for the temporary bike lanes for the pandemic, and they go and rip them all out now. And the thing was the hardest thing for me is flying. I like flying, I like traveling, I like seeing the world, but it's really hard. When we got bought by that big American company, like the week before the pandemic closed everything down, I had to go to New York and 1 day trip, 36 hours in New York City was a month worth of carbon on my budget. So we really have to work at the hierarchy of what should we be promoting, which is obviously, we've got to promote walking and cycling and e-bikes, and the private car and the plane are the last. So as I found, what can we do? What did I find from my spreadsheet? Get out of the car. It's the single biggest factor in most people's footprints. Didn't say get rid of it. One of the wonderful things about doing a spreadsheet is you can amortize it over the whole year. You're not doctrinaire. So we go up north. I have a cabin in the woods that I bought years ago. We go up in June, come back in September, and I can spread that 500 kilometers of driving over the whole summer. Now there's consuming, what we buy. And I didn't think this would be such a big deal because I don't buy that much. Or then again, I do. I have a thing about owning everything that Apple ever made, except the HomePod, which my wife won't let in the house because she thinks it's invasive and is probably right. But I've got everything else here. I've got the iPad, I've got the iMac, I've got the MacBook Pro. And when you total these up, 80 kilograms, 824 kilograms, 174, 113, even my dumb little watch is 38 kilograms of carbon. You try lifting 38 kilograms. It's heavy. It totaled up 1.191 tons of carbon over their lifetimes, which if I amortize them over the years that Apple says they'll last, is 400 kilograms a year, 16% of my annual budget, the single biggest item after the stupid gas furnace that I haven't replaced with a heat pump yet. It was the biggest problem that I personally had. Another problem that I did think about is because I'm an old white guy who's an architect and just wears black turtlenecks, is clothing, which turns out to be a seriously big problem for a lot of people. In another study that I used and looked at, which was Future of Consumption in a 1.5 degree world, which was about people living in cities, they found that clothing and textiles was actually bigger than electronics and appliances and bigger than aviation because not that many people actually fly. It came right after the private car. There's an organization in the UK called Take the Jump that took that study and basically came out and said, really, if you want to do it, you should get 3 new items of clothing per year and buy everything else used. They have a lot of other things too. Have a look at takethejump.org. It's really interesting. Now, talking all like this makes me want a beer. I want to have a beer. And I want to talk about the beer store for a minute, because in Ontario, where we live, we have this thing called the beer store that used to be Brewers Retail. And it's talking about this field of consumption and plastics and our whole society of waste. It is in Ontario, you buy a beer, you drink the beer, you take the bottle back, and it gets washed up to 34 times and has an incredibly low carbon footprint. Our whole society used to be like that. You would get your milk delivered like that. Coke and beer were made locally because returning and refilling bottles was really expensive over any kind of distance. So every community had this. In Ontario, where there's now one giant brewery serving almost the whole province, 50 years ago, there were 5 distilleries, 5 breweries just for this one brand, O'Keefe Ale, that doesn't exist anymore. So, everything was done locally and returned. Then this guy, Bill Coors, in the 50s, developed the 2-piece aluminum can and changed everything. He could use Dwight Eisenhower's highways. He could centralize all the brewing in one place in Colorado, and he could ship it by trucks on those great highways to everywhere. And it was cheap for him to do this. And so he basically put every local brewery down. You probably from your childhood or your parents have told you about, oh, we used to get Pabst Blue Ribbon or this or that or the other, all these beers that don't exist anymore because of what this happened. And McDonald's did it too, when they realized, everybody's driving now. So instead of paying for a whole big restaurant, why don't we sort of let the customers be responsible for sitting and cleaning? We don't need to clean tables. They'll eat in their cars. And nobody understood this. Literally, they had to train us to pick things up and throw them in the garbage because people were just used to throwing it away. They had to get Susan Spotless to say, every little bit hurts. And they had to get that Indian guy, who was actually an Italian, to tell us that, we've got to start recycling, which was the invention of the 1970s because so much garbage was being picked up. And they, cities wanted to have a deposit and everything like they did before. And the industry came up with, no, we're going to recycle. And they brought this guy in. And oh, how well they've trained us that recycling is the greatest thing we can do. From the earliest age, we're training our children that recycling is wonderful. Rocky's recycling truck, my granddaughter's recycling truck, they all have these things because this has been grinded into them. So when the US GBC did a survey to find out how do we get people to think about green buildings, and they asked everything, what's the best thing you can do to live a longer and healthier life? What comes up on top? Recycling, which does nothing. It doesn't even work, as we know. It was all a fraud. Everything was going to China. And what we've got now is 40% is landfilled, 32% is going into our rivers, 14% is going up chimneys, 14% is collected, 8% is downcycled into lumber, and only 2% is actually recycled, where it is reused. And the industry is trying to sell us a bill of goods now about circular economy, where they're going to turn it back into the chemical basis. But, we're not picking it up in the first place. And this is so expensive and energy intensive, it'll never work. It's all a shill so they can just keep selling more petrochemicals and turning them into plastics. And we know people aren't going to take it seriously. If you're in a parking lot of a coffee chain where they've got baskets beside every car, look at how people do it. They throw it out the window. We have to really change our culture to where we don't sip constantly all day from a water bottle or a cup, but we sit down and we enjoy it. We have to lose the culture of convenience. We have to redesign and rethink the whole system and get true circularity like we used to do in the diner and in the beer store. So what do? From computers to clothing, the question about sufficiency applies. How much do we really need? And the best strategy is to buy high quality, timeless design, maintain it well, and use it as long as you can. And my last iPod Pro I bought in 2012, and the damn thing just kept going and going and going. And of course, I got the bug to get the new Apple and had to get the M1, but it lasted 8 years. And all of this Apple stuff does, if you don't get sold into it. I'm not going to talk much about leisure, other than I used to love getting in the car, driving 3 hours to get electrically winched up a hill to slide down artificial snow made with electricity and water, and then drive 3 hours back, and realized I can't do that anymore. And I got myself a set of cross-country skis, and I bungeed them to my e-bike, and I went to High Park, and I just had a great time. And it's much lower energy, and it's better health, and there's no gas. It's not about giving things up. It's about thinking differently and making intelligent choices. This guy who worked for Donald Trump, made this thing about they want to take your pickup truck, they want to rebuild your house, they want to take away your hamburgers. And you know what? He was right. We do. But there's nothing wrong with having a nice little electric vehicle, a warm home that's comfortable and cheap to run, and tasty Beyond Meat burgers. There are alternatives that give you a good life that is sufficient and is sustainable. So in conclusion, I started and it was a simple story. Don't eat red meat, don't drive a gas car, don't get in an airplane. But when you dig in, it's another one. And lessons that popped up is the embodied carbon, the upfront carbon emissions from making stuff is far more important than the operational emissions, and becoming more so every day. My electronics use no energy to run, but the carbon emitted making them almost buried me. How we live and how we get around are not two separate issues. They're the same thing. So it's much easier to live a low carbon lifestyle if you live in a place designed before the car took over, and be it a small town or an older city. And we don't need a radical change in diet. Michael Ingui has to talk afterwards what he was saying before about he lives in Brooklyn, and this, what I'm saying in that paragraph, is very true. An interesting study came out in November, long after my book was out, that went down the left side with all of the things that I talked about: sufficiency, food waste, working from home, battery vehicles. And then it ran over on the other side, on the x-axis, with all of the effects. How is it for food, for health, for sanitation, for shelter, mobility, happiness, and that. And everything blue means it's better. It's made better by doing these things, not just fossil fuels, everything in your life. It's like that silly cartoon from way back in 2009, you know, what if it's all a hoax and we're not really worried about carbon? Well, everything gets better no matter what. And, you know, I end always with this photo from Stockholm in 1928. And if we wanted to, we could colorize it and it could be Toronto or New York City or Vancouver or anywhere in 2028, a city of bikes, streetcars, efficient mid-rise buildings made of low carbon materials, with everyone living a 1.5 degree lifestyle, really without even thinking about it. Because that's what your city, what your urban design and your mode of transportation lets you do. It's our choice. Thank you.
Wow, everybody, why don't you unmute yourself and give Lloyd a round of applause? That was incredible.
Woo!
The tour de force.
Awesome.
Fantastic. Okay, so we are going to go now into the discussion portion of tonight's program. So we are joined, Lloyd will be joined by Susan Rowley of HOK and Michael Ingui of Bax Ingui Architects and the founder of House Accelerator. And we'll do that for probably 15 minutes or so, and then we'll go into Q&A after that. Remember, as you have questions, please put them in chat, and I'm madly doing cutting and pasting and tracking it all. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Lloyd.
To me?
Well,
yeah,
Lloyd,
well.
Lloyd, that it's so funny when you're talking and breathless, and we were talking about how many slides you have. I was like, I'm thinking, oh, I have to follow Lloyd. This is going to be rough. This is going to be hard. You know, there's so much information in there, and it's so broad, but it's so true. There's so much that can be done. You know, the food, the transportation, the clothing. But there's a lot of statistics, a lot of data, a lot of information. You know, it's like a big download. And I was reading the other day Peter Kalmus's book, and he mentions in his book, the Being the Change, is that he says, I now realize that few people respond to facts. And I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on the fact that facts don't really make people change, and what could we do differently, or what do you think could cause that sea change that we need in the way that we behave and buy and consume?
Well, an example that I talk about in the book that I think is really valid to what we're dealing with about carbon now, and even more valid when we're talking about changing our lifestyles in the face of war, is the issue. For instance, look at what happened with smoking. When they finally figured in the 60s that smoking was bad for you, they started all these campaigns to get people to stop. They started changing rules to make it harder to smoke. What really caused the revolution, there were three things. There was obviously regulation, you know, cutting back on advertising and that. The really big thing that I think changed everything was when they discovered about secondhand smoke, that you weren't killing yourself anymore, that you were also killing everybody around you. And that's when people started getting pissed off if somebody was smoking in the room and smoking near you. And that's when it became socially unacceptable. In the Second World War, if someone was ostentatiously spending a lot of money and wasting a lot of stuff in the UK and in England, it was very bad form. People would look at you like, how can you do this? We're in a war. You know, people would wear their old coats and they would wear not their fanciest clothing, even if they had money, because it was really important to be discreet and not show off. And, you know, I think that we have to realize, we have to get people to realize with carbon, it's the same thing. That, you know, when we're driving our car, it's secondhand smoke. It's affecting other people. When we're driving the big pickup truck, we want to, I think, we have to go through what we did with smoking and make it socially unacceptable to be profligate in our carbon usage. And I think that this could happen. It's going to, and I think that it gets a real push with things happening right now. Like I showed that newspaper article, you know, that paging Jimmy Carter, that people are talking like this again, that they're getting serious, that conservation is actually important, that we have to think about we've got to save gas and get it to Europe, turn it liquid and send it to them because we've got to get off Russian gas. And getting off Russian gas is taking 20% of the world's gas off the market. So this may be an opportunity. I kept showing those depressing surveys that nobody cares. And a proportion of the population that really is willing to give stuff up is very small. So the point of my book was, you don't have to all give things up and live in hovels and that. You can have really nice lives. And you just have to change a few things. And of course, we have to, at the upper end, change zoning, make it impossible to build these suburban sprawl houses. And we have to change building codes so that everything is passive house, so that it goes both from personal nudges and government pushes and nudges from the top.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, and Lloyd, by the way, that was fantastic. It was a lot of slides there, right? But it flowed perfectly. And it was a great compliment to the book, and it was very similar to the book in just the sheer number of just clear facts you're describing. And we're seeing it. I mean, I'm lucky to be in New York and in Brooklyn for lots of reasons. We'll talk about the one you described in the book as well. But we're seeing right now in New York, there are enough passive houses here now. There are enough passive projects where a lot of people have walked into one. They've been in one. They've seen one, their friend has one, they're not using heat in the winter, or they've got filtered fresh air. And people are starting to ask themselves, well, why don't I? So I do think that experience for these buildings and experience for what you can have, people get excited about it. And we're definitely seeing that. But Lloyd, in the book you described something I never really thought about as an architect, which is the idea of people living in cities that were designed 110 years ago, and maybe talk about that a little bit. It's such an interesting way of thinking about cities, how we are, and that it is in fact easier for us, one, and then two, one of the I think that the takeaways for me from this, I mean, there's a lot of takeaways that I have a list of things that I think I have to do better but the one thing that I feel like would be interesting is to talk a little bit about the hierarchy of what you should be promoting, which is what you just described. There's just so much. It's like a fire hose of interesting things, but what's first, what's second, what's third? I mean, we all have to go back and tell 10 people and they have to tell 10 people, what's the hierarchy? And I thought that was a great slide.
Well, the biggest thing in anybody's footprint, and actually one that I think is most easily changed, is getting out of the gasoline-powered car and not pretending you're going to wait for an electric car, because that'll solve the problem. I think we're in the middle of an e-bike revolution. The e-bike flattens hills, it extends seasons, and it makes it much easier for older people who aren't in great health to do it. And given that the average, that like 60% of trips in the United States are under 6 miles, it can replace all of those so easily. And so first thing is get out of the car, and you're not giving up a lot to do it in an e-bike. And in diet, the single biggest thing is get rid of the steaks. And, just hit one of those at a time. If you're shopping for a house, remember, smaller is better, an apartment is better. When you go to Vienna, well, you've been to Vienna. I remember standing on a rooftop with you, looking out at this whole development where nobody has a single family house. They all live in these wonderful apartment buildings, about 8 stories tall, where they built the community. They drove the subway out to it before they built the thing. They know how to do it. And their average carbon footprint per person in Vienna is 4 tons. And it's all from schnitzel. And our carbon footprint is 17. So we know how to do this.
Yeah. I like that in your book, it's not just about buildings and transportation, but you also go in about diet. And in, was it Project Drawdown, I think it was?
Yes.
They talk about all the various things that we can do, not only just to stop climate change, but actually reverse climate change. I mean, who talks like that? But food was one of the biggest items there, the waste that happens. And I'm what I call is I'm a convenient vegan, meaning I tell everyone I'm vegan, but as soon as they cringe, I go, if I'm coming over for dinner, I said, don't worry, I'll eat whatever you cook me. But cook for me. I'm sorry, but it's just sort of a way of educating people in a very subtle way, but that the food is a really big component of it. I'm wondering, did you suffer in any ways when you made this transition, Lloyd, when you changed your diet or?
No. And again, it's when you amortize things over a spreadsheet, it's very different. We had a burger occasionally, and a burger may have blown that day because it was 7,200 grams of carbon. But if I don't have another burger for 2 weeks, then it becomes like not a big deal. And so, the whole point of doing it the way I did, instead of your doctrinaire and you can't do anything, so is it's much easier to say, I'll just have that occasionally instead of all the time. And so this is the thing a point that I was trying to make. You've got to be careful. The wonderful thing about the spreadsheets and the numbers is you don't get caught up in the minutiae. Like there was this whole thing in the States about getting rid of plastic straws. And that was mainly because they were going into the ocean and that. But like from a carbon point of view, of course, it's completely negligible. You've got to forget about the little stupid things. Again, my takeout dinner, that Swiss chalet, for years, I wouldn't go to Swiss chalet because I just couldn't believe the waste plastic that came with it. And then I find out that, of course, the delivery was by far the worst of the whole thing. And so we don't go out to Swiss chalet anymore because there's not one that's close enough to walk to. But it didn't mean I'm giving up chicken. It just meant I'm changing.
Yeah. There was also in your book, Lloyd, you talked about, you have a lot of great, your use of language is really, I really enjoy it. And obviously way better than what I can do here. I'm trying to express myself. But you talk about conscious decoupling. And
right.
I like that term. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by conscious decoupling?
Well, I sort of joked about it with when Gwyneth Paltrow separated from her husband. She called that conscious decoupling, I believe, and I picked up the term because decoupling is a term that is used a lot about, can you separate your what you do from carbon? Can you decouple it from carbon? And if you read Vaclav Smil and all the big books, they all say, no, you can't. But you can, of course you can. I mean, I decouple my transportation from carbon by going by bike. Excuse me. I decouple my food from carbon by not eating a steak. You're just making choices of alternatives. You're decoupling things from carbon. And I think that if you consciously look at everything like that in the choice, how do I couple this from carbon? There are a lot of things that you can do. The only one I haven't figured out is how to take a vacation to Europe. I keep checking the container ship schedules, but it's not very convenient.
The bike comment has come up quite a bit in the chat, and I will say, I'm lucky. I live in Brooklyn. I work in Manhattan. Actually, I think I've ridden to work since I was 13. I mean, I own a car when we use it sometimes, but I really do ride a bike to work. I mean, not every day. My partner, who's 68 right now, rides a bike almost every day, even when I don't. So he makes me feel guilty. But I will say, bike lanes make a huge difference. I've seen a massive uptick, and maybe talk about this a little bit, Lloyd, because I know you've been an avid cyclist forever. Bike lanes, and then the e-bike is getting people on bikes that would never have been on a bike before.
Exactly.
So
look, this is very important, and this goes back to the point that we can't do this on our own. We need government intervention and help too, and political intervention, because we need three things to make bicycles and e-bikes work properly, and that's a safe place to ride and a secure place to park. And if you don't have these things, with an e-bike costing almost as much as a car in a lot of cases, then you're going to have situations people aren't going to be willing to do it if they don't feel safe. And so right now in Toronto, the main street in Toronto, Yonge Street, there's a huge battle with all of the rich people who live all around it. They don't like the bike lane that was put in. They slowing them all down. And everyone else says, are you crazy? This is the most important street. We need this bike lane. And so these battles happen everywhere. Giving up car space for bike lanes is a huge battle everywhere. But if we don't do it, people won't ride. And we have to look at what they did in Copenhagen and in Denmark, which they did in the 70s in the oil crisis, to say, okay, this is the answer. And they just said, this is what we're doing. And governments did it both in New York and in Toronto in the pandemic, saying, we're doing this for the pandemic. And we all saw how wonderful it was. And we're all fighting tooth and nail to hang on to it. But it's not something that we can just do and tell people, get on your bike, because they won't do it if they don't feel safe.
So I learned a new term tonight. I don't know if anybody else did, but I've never heard the term climatarian before.
Oh.
And I Googled it while I was speaking. It's a great term. Maybe talk about that a little bit more.
Well, it's actually a term that was developed in New York by a woman who, there's a salad chain in New York that's very healthy salads that has returnable bowls, and I forget her name, but they've started advertising their climatarian menu for this New York salad joint. And I was talking to her and she said, well, I really got it from somewhere else, but we're just trying to play it up a lot to say, we can't get everybody to be vegetarian or vegan, or can't get everybody to be vegan. And we know that being vegetarian doesn't even do anything for you if you're eating eggs and cheese and everything else. So it was, and again, if you're a vegan eating hothouse tomatoes and Peruvian asparagus all winter, then you're doing a worse job than if you were eating meat. So that's why I think the term is so great. And I try to promote it all the time, because that's how you have to look at your food. It's decoupling your food from your carbon.
Lloyd, so in your book, you talk about sufficiency, and basically sufficiency is the downscaling of consumption, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, because I didn't hear you mention it too much in your presentation.
I could spend a whole half hour on it. It's another presentation. Sufficiency is key. Sufficiency is this concept. This philosopher, Samuel Alexander, is in Australia, wrote about it. We've been all our lives, we've been focusing on efficiency, and we know what happens with efficiency. Cars get more efficient, they get bigger. Houses got more insulation, they got bigger. We invent LED lights. You see them encrusting buildings. You see people putting hundreds of them on their ceiling in their dining room. You can do surgery in people's dining room tables now because they've got 50 LED lights on top of them. And so, sufficiency is asking what is enough. And what Samuel Alexander said, the line that I like is, without sufficiency, efficiency is lost. Like all our moves towards making things more efficient are completely lost if we don't also think about sufficiency at the same time. How much do we actually need to actually do this? And I just don't think anyone should be talking about efficiency without talking about sufficiency. I see these massive living building challenge houses because only people with $1 zillion can have a living building challenge house. And they think, really, I mean, what's the footprint of all this? You've got to think about sufficiency. And that means living with what you need. My kids grew up, left the house. I wanted to sell the house. My wife didn't. What did we do? We renovated it. I'm in my lovely home office I designed in the lower level. We live in half the apartment and half the space, rent out the top, so half of it. So it's sufficient for us. I've got a great office. I've got a lovely bedroom right over there. I won't show you because the bed's not made. And it works really, really well, and it is sufficient. And so I think that that's a word that we should always keep top of our mind. Without sufficiency, efficiency is lost.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thanks. So Zach, are we on to questions now?
Yeah, we are. This has been so great. And we have some great questions coming up. And just before we get to those questions, I want to thank the fine organizations that help make everything possible at the Accelerator. So thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks also to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors, Proseco, and SIGA. And thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thank you too to our patron sponsors, Aero Aggregates, Aero Barrier, Brennan, Brooklyn Solar Works, Euroline Windows, Enotech Windows and Doors, Lamelux, Owens Corning, RDH Building Science, Sanderson Sustainable Design, and US Engineered Wood T-Stud. So big thank you to our sponsors. Okay, so I have been sifting through, there've been a lot of comments and a lot of questions, and I'm gonna stick with the questions for now. And we're gonna start off with Chris Spikalski, sorry about the mispronunciation, Chris. If you're still here, can you ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, it's such a great presentation. It's so heartening to hear how many other cyclists there are in the group. I usually, when I can, I bike about 17 to 20 miles one way to work, and it's just a great way to get around and start the day and things like that. My question was more about, I think Project Drawdown listed refrigerants as the fourth biggest concern, and I'm wondering how you treat it's really the leaking of refrigerants into the atmosphere that's causing the global warming. So how should we look at that?
Well, this is a really interesting problem, because if you speak to, there's a whole gang out there in the States now. Excuse me, I hope you don't mind. I didn't have sufficient wine before. I just went and got one. So I'm gonna see me sipping wine. Now that everybody's talking about electrify everything and let's heat pumpify everything, every one of those heat pumps are full of refrigerants. So we bring in all those heat pumps and we theoretically are solving a big problem, and we're creating a whole new one, because many of them are filled with refrigerants like R22, which came in after Freon was stopped because of the ozone hole. And now there are new, more expensive refrigerants that are much better. And there are carbon dioxide heat pumps that use carbon dioxide, which only heat, they don't cool, but are really good. But what's interesting is, again, it's all political. In Europe, they're selling a lot of heat pumps that have propane as the refrigerant. And propane is a really good refrigerant, and it has a carbon global warming coefficient of 3, which is only 3 times as bad. But DuPont had so much money invested in refrigerants that they fought for years to prevent propane being accepted as a refrigerant in the United States and Canada. They got Underwriters Laboratory to say it isn't safe, and to put incredible limits on the size of the heat pumps. So even now that it's finally approved, there are still limits on the size of the heat pumps that have propane in them, for good reason. And again, it's sufficiency. In Europe, those propane heat pumps are probably big enough to do almost every house and every apartment that wants them, because people generally live in smaller spaces. In North America, I wonder what proportion of the impact it could have. But you're absolutely right. It's a very big issue. If we electrify and heat pumpify everything, then we've got to make sure we're using refrigerants that are healthy and safe.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Lloyd. Okay, so up next is Carol Parr. So
I'm here. I am.
Okay, great.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you, Lloyd. Coming back to the slide regarding the eating of the food from your chicken outlet back to the diet of a previous era, approximately how much in percentage did you find that it saved? Did you find it as a percentage, maybe?
To what? By
from
switching
today
to going back to the sort of 19th century diet?
Yes. Yes.
Oh God, I would say roughly 2/3. It really knocked it way back. We were not, because of my wife's previous experience in cooking this way, we weren't eating anything that was really imported a long distance. Again, it's hard to calculate all of that. We never ate any prepared food. She's a wonderful cook, so we're always eating fresh food. We didn't order Swiss chalet again through that. We did have the occasional burger, but we cut it way back. And it's just about making those conscious choices. The exact percentage, I don't know, but it made a huge difference.
Yeah, because I find that older people still tend to buy or tend to live in that older era compared to they don't go out and buy takeaways or travel by car to go and get those things. And so that's why I was just asking about the percentage, because there's still quite a large population of older people living like, well, not living like that, but you know, making that conscious decision not to buy takeaway and not to go to the shops and buy extraordinary amount of food that they would not pay because they don't want to pay for it. It's the cost to them.
It's the money.
Case. Yeah.
Other people take the totally different approach. My mother died just a few years ago. When she used to cook, whenever I'd go over there, in the middle of winter, there would be asparagus on the table. I'd say, "Mom, this is all flown from Peru. Why do you do this?" Said, "I grew up in the Depression where we didn't get vegetables in winter. Then in the 50s, we had canned asparagus. Then in the 70s, we had frozen asparagus. And now I get it flown in from Peru. Isn't this the most wonderful example of how our technology is fantastic?" I said, "Mom, you don't understand." She said, "I like my asparagus." So, you know, old people aren't necessarily the automatic conservers. She was a big spender on asparagus.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you, Carol. Next up is Bronwyn Berry.
Hey, Lloyd. Hey, everyone.
Hi, Bronwyn.
Thanks for that. So, Lloyd, I have your book. It's fabulous. And I wanted to ask you, what was the thing that you found hardest to change, the habit or the, item, the purchase? And then what was the easiest, just to get a sense of how that worked for you?
The easiest was giving up red meat. I mean, it's nice, but like, so are other meats, and my wife's a wonderful cook and she was really good about it. So I never really minded giving up that. The hardest was one that in this one case, I had a lucky pandemic. I couldn't do the things that I would like to do, which is get on a plane and travel. But if I was going to say I'm going to continue this lifestyle, the one thing that I know would be absolutely the worst is that I do not want to give up traveling. I want to go to Portugal for the Passive House Convention. I wanted to go to Finland this summer on a Decoupling tour. This is stuff that I love. And this is the thing we're all going to face, because if you've got the money to travel, it's a really nice thing to do. So that's absolutely the hardest.
Thanks. Yeah, I empathize deeply.
Well,
on
you
that
have family.
score.
You have family all over the world. I mean, you could not say I'm not flying because they're everywhere, right?
Yeah, it is hard. Yeah, but coming up with alternates and making a plan for it, I think, is the conscious part. Is what we have to figure out, right? I love my e-bike though. I have to plug for that, and the food thing has also been really easy and fun. So, all right, I'll let other people take that away. Thanks, guys. Fabulous conversation.
I like Carol Parr's comment. This is so easy. Travel in your own backyard. I love Sydney beaches. I mean, yes, if you happen to have Sydney beaches, you want to see the Toronto beach? It's cold.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bronwyn. So up next is Alana Judah.
Hi, Lloyd. Great presentation.
Thanks, Alana.
I remember when we talked about this serving meat in Vienna at the Passive House conference and whether that was appropriate. So that was a while ago. I had some basic questions more about how we get the word out. First of all, when's your TED Talk? Number one. Number two is, which A-list celebrity are you going to bring on board to adopt this approach and promote it, if you had a choice? Because I think we're all preaching to the converted somewhat here, and I think that this is a very big question, and I think a very important one that belongs out there to everybody. And I think that your slide, just sort of to make a comment, your slide about the intersection of well-being and health with these lifestyle choices is the key to that, getting it more broadly out there. So just wanted to ask you, yeah, how do we get the word out beyond our group?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a reason that the WELL system of certification is eating the lunch of every other system out there. It's because people care about health. They care about their body, and they, it's all about me in the end. We're basically selfish. And so I think that playing the health aspect of this is critical. Get rid of your gas stove and your killing PM 2.5 emissions. And, that's the only way we'll ever get the celebrity on. Maybe I'll get Gwyneth Paltrow to do it. I don't know. But because this is, it's about health. It's like that chart and that silly cartoon said. That is, I think, the best approach to get people to understand it. It's about, if you think about what's coming out of the tailpipes of cars, besides just carbon dioxide, and you're trying to bike every day and you're breathing that stuff, it's about health to get those cars off the road and the gas out of our house. And I think that you've hit that's a big approach that we have to take. As for TED, if somebody asks, I'll do it.
Someone's got some contacts at TED. I know we have some people, powerful people here in this network. So we're going to get you on.
Thanks, Alana. Okay, up next is Tom Phillips. And Tom, you had a couple questions. Maybe choose one and we'll get back to you for the next one.
Yeah, a quick comment. Thanks so much, Lloyd, for the big picture and the great visuals and inspiration. It makes me rethink travel and how we certainly miss airplane travel in foreign places. But I'm still seeing a lot of younger people travel just for social things, weddings or little vacations or whatever, which we all used to do. But they, at least even in environmentally conscious younger adults that I know, including my kids, they're still doing a fair amount of travel. And so I'm thinking, maybe we need to set some kind of quota and a carbon number and labeling that people can readily, track and make sure they're following some kind of budget reduction, even a little bit. So that's that. Thanks for that inspiration. My question about biking is, yeah, we do a lot of biking in Davis, but it's built for biking, and some places aren't. And we have pretty mild weather and flat ground. E-bikes are taking off, especially with older folks. But for folks that still aren't physically or able to do biking, or if they live far away from services, what do you recommend, for short, long-term strategies to shift, reduce those emissions? Because and people that commute to work a fair amount, that's still the bigger chunk of transportation emissions, I would guess.
Well, first of all, I mean, even in Copenhagen, 50% of the people still drive. And, we can't be doctrinaire, but if we went from the 3 to 5% we have in North America to 50%, imagine the difference that would make. If there are a few people who can't get on a bike for various health reasons, or they feel, or their distances are too long, well, fine, then a few of them will be driving. If half of them are actually off the road, we've taken half the problem away. But also those people, again, the incentives have to be there to promote alternatives. Like people can commute longer distance with e-bikes if there's safe infrastructure for them to do it. And we have to build that. The other thing about the traveling is we've incentivized alternatives to flying. If you go to Europe, you can go almost everywhere in Europe in a fast train. And it's fantastic, and it's really low carbon. And yet people fly there much more than we fly because of EasyJet and Ryanair. They're so incredibly cheap that, and every year I was going to Portugal to speak at the Passive House conference, and I went up to Porto, and I was like on this trip with these couples that they just flew in for the weekend. My sister-in-law lives in London. She just flies places for the weekend because it's so cheap and so easy. What we have to do is disincentivize that by properly taxing airplane fuel, which isn't taxed at all right now by international treaty. We have to start charging the full carbon cost of it, maybe with a carbon tax. And in North America, we have to build some bloody rails fast. put something in there that works. I mean, they rolled, I've zipped across China at 350 kilometers with a coin, sort of, you can stand it on end on the windowsill and it won't fall over. The trains are so fabulous. The last conference I went to before the pandemic was a wood conference in Quebec City, and coming back, I mean, my teeth were almost rattling out of my head because the rail bed was so terrible and it could only go 100 kilometers an hour. So this is something that with investment we can fix, that people will have alternatives to getting on a plane, but it's something that we've really got to get cooking on.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tom. PL, you had a question about the future.
Whoops. Hi, Zach. Sorry, that's me. It's Porritt. Yeah, awesome presentation, Lloyd. It's fantastic. But the graph you put up at the beginning, if you're a betting man, what do you think our chances of survival are? Because it seems to me, as a species, we're way too self-absorbed.
We'll survive, but it's not going to be very pleasant. And it's going to be, we're really exporting the harm to other people because, again, the biggest climate change effects are people in the South, people in low-lying countries, people who don't have the money to do anything remediating to adapt. I'm sitting here in Toronto by the largest freshwater reservoir in the world, 300 feet above sea level in a temperate climate. I mean, I suspect people around me will be pretty happy. But the problem is that carbon dioxide goes everywhere. And what we do here, driving the car, is affecting someone on the other side of the world. And so that's the problem. The problem is selfishness. The 10% that's responsible for 50% of the carbon emissions also has the money to move to where the effects will be less harmful, and they're leaving the other 90% of the population to suffer. And that's the fundamental problem we've got. So no, I'm sorry, I try to be always optimistic and always think, yes, we can do it, and we can do it. But when it gets down to the hard truth in that, a lot of people are going to suffer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you, PL. Okay, so next up is Jim Kuman. Sorry for the pronunciation.
Hi there. Find the mute button.
All right. Hey, Jim.
I've been doing a lot of the urbanist work on this kind of equation. That the Jarrett Walker quote is absolutely it. And I live in Minneapolis, so we got to keep things warm here. But I guess the world's going to get warmer, so that's the good news for us. I do a lot of work at the intersection of transportation and zoning, as well as I'm a developer. And so getting people to build more housing is hard enough as it is, let alone keep it put in the right place. I'm being brought into a lot of conversations in places that, like the ones you described, we disperse to, right? Decentralized to. Some places that are close to core cities, it's easy. But the places that are, my question is the places that are not. And I pose this as too carbon intensive to fix, right? If that can even be described, and perhaps maybe you have some idea about what is too far gone. They're just like we gave up our central cities and let them to rot, which 70 years later we're still recovering from. Do you see that we can pick up like we did after World War II for very rational reasons, and we left to decentralize? Can we come back from the places that are too carbon intensive to fix or to keep going? And will we have the political will to do so? Because we're subsidizing those places right now from things we decided from 80 years ago. Can we stop the subsidies so we can come back?
Well, this is something that I think we can solve, again, by looking at the numbers like with cycling. 74% of Americans now live in essentially urban and suburban areas. And we're talking a much smaller percentage. Everyone says, oh, I've got to drive 15 miles to get to the Walmart. I said, well, but you're in a very small proportion of the population. They're a loud proportion of it, but most people live in cities and suburbs. And the suburbs can be, I think they are being, whether people, I look in Toronto where, the suburbs, they're putting up condos in ridiculous places that I never thought, but people want housing and they're intensifying all over the city because people are moving here. If you go to San Francisco and LA, everybody's fighting over upzoning. Everybody's talking about this. I saw a lot of it the one time I was in Minneapolis 3 years ago, that there was wonderful development, great streetcars and things happening there. So the fact of the matter is the good urban, that the suburbs can be intensified. And again, I think this is where, and there was an English study confirming it, that this is where the e-bike revolution is going to have its biggest impact, because people in cities already have alternatives of subways and walking and everything's close. In the suburbs where the transit is awful, there were no alternatives, basically. You know, you could wait for an hour for the bus, or you could have your car. And the suburbs are where the roads are wide enough that you can put in bike infrastructure cheaply without everybody going screaming blue murder, because you'll still have lanes for cars. And so that's where I think we're going to see a real revolution from them, because they make the suburbs, the fact that everything's far apart, they bring them closer together without needing a car. So that's my thoughts on that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. So next up is Dan Shoemaker. Make sure Dan is here.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Great.
Let me see. I'll be reading this.
Oh.
Please comment on these 6 markers of climate emergency as a necessary radical correction to climate change. And I can read them if you like.
Please.
Number 1 is, and this is the climate emergency unit. So number 1 is spend what it takes to win. And number 2 is create new institutions to get the job done. Number 3 is shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. Number 4 is tell the truth about severity of the crisis and communicate a sense of urgency. Number 5 is leave no one behind. And number 6 is a recent addition, and it's Indigenous leadership and rights are essential to winning.
Oh, this could be another whole half-hour talk, I think, going with these. This is very hard. I think that these are the kinds of things we've been talking about. The Indigenous one is new, you're right, but all the others is the way we've been thinking about climate for the last 10 years, and we've run out of time. And so I think that now we have to just say, we've got to fix this right now, and that's going to take governments changing regulations, which I think they'll now be willing to do. It's got to take people grabbing the bull by the horns, and that we're past the time for, at least the way I listened to what you were saying. I don't have any individual answers to those questions. I'm sorry.
I think the starter is that we get rid of the expression baby steps.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have time for baby steps.
Yeah. Thank you. You speak as well as you write, and you write really well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, so next up is Kelsey Ross.
Hi, thank you. So my question is more about composting, and knowing that food waste and demand is such a big priority and contributor to climate change. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on composting, and if that's a way that we could reduce our waste footprint. I know there's a lot of ties there with food waste in terms of excess purchasing, but is that a way, or do you see that becoming more prominent as we talk about and become more aware of our waste?
Well, it's interesting because I think composting is very much like when companies are proud of the fact that they make their new product with pre-consumer waste. And you ask, well, what is pre-consumer waste? And say, oh, it's an offcut, it's a piece we screwed up on, it's a piece we didn't need, so we chop it up and we throw it back in. And what pre-consumer waste is they made a mistake and they have a piece of crap, so they're throwing it back in. And in a way, I feel the same way about composting. I mean, why do we have something to compost? Like, I mean, definitely coffee grounds. No way you're going to be using to avoid them. But in most of the stuff that we compost, it's coming from stuff because we cooked too much, or because we didn't finish it off our plates, or because it rotted in the back of the fridge. So I think composting is great. We have great urban composting in the city, but I think that the target should be to not have anything to compost in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelsey. Mark Brandt, you're up.
Hi, Lloyd. I won't be flying down to Toronto from Ottawa anytime soon, but I won't be biking either. But luckily, we have pretty good train service. I'm not sure if my teeth got rattled on it or not, but it's pretty good.
But you have such a terrible train station. Got to drive out to the suburbs just to get the damn thing.
The train station is wonderful. The location sucks.
Yes, agreed.
So coming out of the pandemic, I am like you. I love to travel, and I am going crazy trying to figure out. I don't want to do any local traveling. I've done enough of that in the pandemic. But so I'm completely unaware of any new advancements in the greening of jet fuel, like maybe hydrogen or biofuel or something. Do you or anyone on the call have anything to tell us on that front?
Well, there is progress. There's progress in what they call SAF, sustainable airplane fuel, which a lot of companies are committing to buy a percentage of. The problem is there is so little of it. Right now, I think it's 0.5% of the fuel. And the problem also is it's competing with all other uses that want it, because it's made from food, it's made from animal waste, grease, and things like that, that there are a lot that everybody's chasing. So there's not that much of it. There's lots of talk about hydrogen planes being done, but green hydrogen barely exists now, and it's got to be more of it. And the problem is, at least until the pandemic hit, was that there were just these endless predictions of growth in the number of people who are flying, which is going to totally overwhelm everything that they do. So there is progress, but the best way to get the progress happening is really to have alternatives to flying, which are like really fast trains, like they have in Europe, which I know it would be longer in Canada. And they say in a couple of years, you'll be able to zip to Toronto on a high-speed train. They're talking about it. So I'll look forward to that.
Great. Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so right now I have one last question in the queue from Patrick Schaefer. Before, Patrick, you ask your question, I just want to let people know that if I missed your question or if a new question has occurred to you, please pose it in chat now, and so that we don't wrap up before you get a chance. Okay, so Patrick, please take it away.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, good. I just want to say I've been a longtime reader of Lloyd's and appreciate the wide-ranging discussion and happy to see it get a wider audience, increasing. I guess similar to that, I thought I would like to add another dimension to this wide-ranging conversation tonight. The comments on straws and recycling notwithstanding, it doesn't seem like plastics in general get enough attention. Particularly since they touch on a multitude of the categories that you mentioned, from emissions to waste and to health. Could you maybe take a shot at putting the use of plastics into the context with some of the other variables you mentioned?
Well, I think I talked about in the last section how we had to get rid of this culture of convenience that we've been trained in by the auto manufacturers, by the fast food people who don't want to pay rent and things. So we've been convinced that, we have to get our takeout thing, our plastic cup, our plastic water bottle. The whole idea that we have to hydrate constantly is a fraud that was invented by the water companies. So, you know, the single-use plastics, the stuff that is just going into that's not being picked up, not being recycled. You know, we're all paying taxes to empty those bins, to deal with the stuff. The plastics companies aren't paying for it. So we have to change our culture to eliminate single-use plastics. And the fossil fuel industry really is imagining that as cars go electric, they're going to pivot to plastic. They now 5% of fossil fuels go into plastic. They imagine in 2050 it's going to be 40% of where their fuel oil is going to, and they're going to try and figure out how to make everything we can out of plastic. And of course, you know that like PVC plastic is softened with phthalates, which are hormones and hormone disrupting, and there's all kinds of other problems. Plastics are wonderful things. I mean, we couldn't have gotten through the pandemic without all the PPP that was made from plastic. It can save lives and it makes a lot of useful things, but we've got to get rid of the single-use stuff. And that's cultural. That's how we've been trained and marketed by all of these companies to just consume, consume, consume. And so that's my answer, is that that's a societal change that can be done by putting deposits on everything, that can be done by making us really comfortable to go to a coffee shop and sit down and to not believe, you know, take cup holders out of cars. Whose stupid idea was that? You know, in Japan, they didn't know what to do for years because the idea of eating in your cars is abhorrent. You might get something dirty in the car. There is not a single cup holder in a Japanese car. And they had to send over crews of designers to North America to find out, because when they first put them in, they were too small. And so now every year they're going to all the stores and they're seeing, you know, what are they selling now? What is the Vente turned into and the Grande into that? To design their cars to accommodate the cups, because we've turned our cars into dining rooms. And that was a cultural thing. And so we have to change the culture.
Yeah, I should also point out the use of the reuse of bottles as part of that too. 30 years ago, they were doing that in Denmark, but they're using cans just like we are now.
Right.
All right, thank you. So we have a question from Tom Phillips.
Hey, one big picture softball question for you, Lloyd. Climate refugees. I know folks at UBC and others had, you know, been working on that a while back. And the recent reports say there's going to be hundreds of millions of climate refugees, you know, I don't know, within the next few decades, and likely food and water shortages. We're already seeing, you know, geopolitical warfare from droughts and so on for the last few decades. So, and we'd all love to move to Canada. So, you know, can we build an ADU next to you, or bring our trailer up, or?
There's lots of room. There's lots of room.
But for long-term planning, what kind of strategies would you suggest or start to think about?
This is the kind of thing where I go back to my book and I just say, you know, I was really just trying to live a 1.5 degree lifestyle, because some of these issues are too big and too complex and too hard to deal with. All I know is that this year, that if you go back to the history of the Arab Spring that started in Tunisia and Egypt about 10 years ago, whenever it was, it started over the price of bread. Yep. It started over the governments there were not subsidizing the bread anymore. And if you look what's happening now with the Ukrainian Russian crops not getting to Egypt and to the Arab countries, we'll get a really good taste this summer of what's going to be happening in terms of climate refugees, political revolutions, and things like that, because there's no fertilizer right now. Its prices have gone way up. Wheat prices have gone up. Corn prices have gone up. Everything is just going completely insane in terms of this. And for the rich people in that, we'll pay a little more for our croissant, but it makes a big difference in Egypt. And so we'll be beginning to see economic climate change refugees. To the bigger problem in that, obviously it's beyond something that I can really address.
Well, thank you, Lloyd. What an amazing evening. It's been really fantastic and a great Q&A session as well. And also thank you to Michael and Susan for being our discussants with Lloyd. Michael and Susan, do you have any final thoughts you want to share before we close up? Oh, Susan, I think you're muted.
I have to answer Stephen Bloom first, who said, my composting answer was poor. What does he do with his banana peel and his apple core? And he's right. We still should be composting, but we can compost a lot less if we're careful in our food.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, though, Stephen.
Thanks. I'm glad you got that in, Lloyd. But I wanted to just say I really appreciated being here because when Patrick said that he was a longtime reader, I also am a longtime reader of your work, Lloyd. And it's actually you who got me here at the Passive House Accelerator. I've never mentioned that before, but because you talked about it and I thought I'd check it out. And now I'm a Passive House certified person and all that stuff. And I hope that you'll have such a positive change on many people's lives. And I really thank you for everything you've done.
Oh, thank you, Susan.
Yeah, I would say the same. Well, first of all, we should put a link to the book in the chat. But there you go. But I would say, you know, Lloyd, the same. This has been great. The book was great. And I think. And it does affect you. You read it, you know. I have a list of things that I could do better, and it's always good to have a list of things you could do better. And I don't know that I'm realistically going to do them all, but I'm going to try. And it's good. It's you know, each piece of it, and you might go back to something, and it helps you. It's a good book. Thanks. And this was great. This was a really good compliment to the book. So if anybody hasn't read it, kind of looking at this recording again, which will be up on the Accelerator site soon, and reading the book, it's a good combo. So thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you both. Thank you all.